Hello, fellow drawers. My name is Valerie. I am a self-taught digital artist. So, I've been thinking about how to make this video for quite some time, and I'll just say it was quite a struggle. I don't know if this is like a disclaimer or something, but I am a self-taught artist, which means that I never got any formal official education in art. I learned everything I know via YouTube tutorials, studying other people's works, and simply trial and error, learning from my mistakes. So I probably will not be able to explain everything with the correct art terms from the book of art because I don't know all the terms and I just know how I do things. When I got my very first comment asking about a rendering tutorial, I was like, what do you mean? Tutorial? It just kind of happens. What do you mean? And it took me quite a long time to be able to dissect and understand what I'm actually doing and put it into words to now explain it to you. So with that said, let's get started. I will be using some of my recent drawings, mostly this one, to explain exactly what I'm doing because I like my rendering on these drawings. Step 1. Flat colors. Before you start rendering, you have to make sure your flat colors look good. They are also called base colors because that is the base for your future rendering. If your flat colors are ugly, no rendering is gonna fix that. So the first thing you need to do is to make sure that all your flat colors are about the same saturation. They can be lighter or darker, they can be different colors, but the saturation has to be pretty much the same. Because if I make some parts more or less saturated than others, then all the colors will look kind of dirty and it will look just off. And the second thing, to make your base colors look even better and to help them enhance your future rendering, add some color variation, some gradients, instead of filling the area with just one solid color. That will just add a little more flavor to your drawing. I always do that with skin. I add blush, the same color on the tip of the nose, the tips of the ears, on the tips of the fingers, knees, elbows, shoulders. Then I always make the bottom half of the face a little colder, so I take my skin color and I make it a little less saturated and a little lighter. So I apply this color kind of right here and I blend it up. So the face color goes kind of like the light chin part, then the blush part, and then the original skin color on the forehead. Also, I always take this light chin color that I already have and put it like here in the eye bag, in the inner corner of the eye where you usually put your concealer. I like to think that if you know how to do makeup, you already know how to render a face. I also, of course, add color on the lips and the eyelids. Usually, if my character is not wearing makeup, then this color is just a little darker than my blush cheek color. If the character is wearing makeup, then use any color you want. I also love to add a gradient to the hair. Just, it doesn't have to be super noticeable, just make like it go from the dark roots to like a little bit lighter and more saturated ends, or the opposite. That will make your hair look just a little more interesting. Step 2. Shading. Now that our flat colors look tasty, we can start shading. So first, let me show you. Here I have a bunch of layers with my flat colors. Different parts of the character are on different layers. That way it is easier for me to work with each part. And on top of every flat color layer, I create a clipping mask layer and put that layer on multiply. Now, if you're a beginner, I'd suggest creating 2 shading clipping mask layers for each flat layer. I feel like that is less stressful. I do that all the time as well because when I'm shading, I do it in 2 steps. The first step is the big shadows and the second one is the small shadows. But before we talk about big and small shadows, let's choose the shadow color. The formula of getting your shadow color is you take your base color and you make it either colder or warmer depending on your light source. If the lighting on your character is warm, then the shadows will be cold. If the light on your character is cold, then the shadows will be warm. I usually go with warm light, cold shadows, so I make my color a little colder and I make it a tiny bit darker. A little, just a little bit. It's very important you don't make the shadows too dark because that will look super dirty and ugly and ew. If you're struggling to find the right shading color, then it's better you just take this flat color and put the layer on multiply and just shade with the same color, then making the shadow color way too dark. Nothing has been ruining my past drawings as much as just too much contrast in lights and shadows. Now, the big shadows show us where the general light is coming from. So you take a big brush. First of all, I forgot to mention, I use the default medium airbrush in Procreate. I use it for everything from start to finish. I don't use any other brush. So you make your brush bigger and you just forget about all the details on your character and just look at the big shapes. For example, a head is a sphere. So you shade your head like you would shade a sphere. If the light doesn't hit the neck, shade the neck fully. Hands are cylinder shapes, so shade them like cylinder. Don't be afraid to put some areas completely in shadow. When you're shading a 3D object that is in the open space like this, remember that the darkest shadow will not be on the very edge of the shape, but rather somewhere in the middle where the shadow ends and the light begins. Because when an object is in the open space, the surfaces around this object reflect the light and create a bounce light. So what I do is I put down my shadow like this. This is a 2D flat shading. If you have a cartoony 2D style, then that's fine, that's okay. But my style is semi-realistic, so what I do is I take my smudge tool and pressing at like 50% strength, I smudge and kind of erase my shadow. Actually, I think you can use an eraser. I don't know, I'm just used to a smudge tool. So you can still tell that this part is in shadow, but the darkest point of this shadow is right here on the edge where our shadow ends and our light begins. And remember that the lightest shadow is still darker than the darkest light. So we're done shading our big shapes, so now we create another clipping mask multiply layer on top of this one for our smaller shadows. And now we go back to the same big shapes and we start trying to dissect them into smaller ones, looking for the same spheres and cylinders. So for example, you can say that the nose is kind of a sphere shape, the eyes and the eyelids is kind of a sphere shape, also indicating the different planes of the face. I always indicate this kind of crease. The lighting doesn't allow you to really see that, but this crease between our hollow eye sockets and our nose cheek area that goes kind of like this. That's just usually what I prefer to do on my characters' faces. That's not like 100% realistic. It's not usually that pronounced on real people. I'd say that's a more of a stylistic choice, but anyways, that's what I do. So no matter what you're shading, the darkest point is usually always going to be contrasted with the lightest point. So when I'm working on the small shadow layer, not only do I add smaller shadows, but I also go back into my big shadows. I take a colder, darker color and indicate some of the darkest points under the chin, in the nostrils, under the arms, and other places where the light doesn't hit the surface. And I also always use 2 layers of shading on the hands and fingers because there are a lot of creases and smaller details that you have to really work on. I talked about how I shade my hair in my line art tutorial video. I went in full detail and explained my whole process, so I will not go like really in depth about that here, but basically I select chunks of hair and do the same process as with everything else. Big shadows first, small shadows second, using the smudge tool, the eraser, the lasso tool, and going chunk by chunk until all hair is done. That process takes a lot of time and patience, especially when I draw characters that have a lot of hair. Then the hair shading process can take longer than everything else combined, but I love the way it looks and I find it pretty therapeutic, so that's why I do it the way I do. Step 3 is lighting. Most of my characters are just standing, floating in the void with a rectangle for a background. I don't know, I just don't like drawing backgrounds or nature or any kind of location art at all, just not my thing. I love dedicating all my time to the characters themselves, making sure the pose looks dynamic, working on small outfit and hair details. That's what I like. So I never really do any complex advanced lighting scenarios. All of my characters stand in kind of a basic studio lighting, lit from the front, so I don't do much for my lighting layers, but this is what I do. I make a screen layer on top of everything, on top of my liner, and I add a rim lighting coming from the back of the character to make the character's silhouette stand out more. And on the same screen layer, I usually add some smaller highlight points, which are highlights in the eyes, near the nostrils, in the corners of the eyes, on the tip of the nose, above the top lip, on the bottom lip, and here in the corners of the mouth. Now for the hair highlights, I usually just make this wiggly messy line that goes all across the hair, following the hair shape, and then I start slowly erasing it from the top and from the bottom, erasing the space between the hair strands until I get this soft, smooth highlight. I never use too light of a color. I usually make the highlight color just a little bit lighter than the hair color because your hair is not made of metal or latex. It cannot have this bright white highlights. Step 4, final touches. Here I usually add like 2 layers that act kind of like filters for an even juicier, tastier look. One of them is usually a multiply layer. I select the entire silhouette of my character and then I take a big airbrush and I add this big shadow going from the bottom of the character to the focus point, which is the face. Not too dark, not too light, just a subtle shadow. And the other layer that I create is the overlay layer. I also choose the entire silhouette, also take the biggest brush and do the opposite thing. I add this overlay bright color on the top of the character to make the focus point more saturated. But I apply it very softly to not make it like super saturated. Also, sometimes I make another layer, which is a normal layer where I add some small extra hairs, but that's not necessary. I didn't do it here at all. But when I do it, I recently started doing it with this brush from this brush set that I won in an art contest from this artist. It's an amazing brush set. It's really cool. I just sometimes I use it to like add this extra hair or have some fun. Just so that's pretty much it. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask them in the comments. I will try my best to answer all of them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. If it was, then press like, subscribe. I'll be making more content like this in the future. You can check out my art on Instagram or here on YouTube Shorts. And yeah, bye bye. See ya. Wanna say hi? Hi. Now I will go for a walk with this little piglet.